that could help inform the process and the results after this one. I agree in many ways with Wes, and that is that Ishtak 1 represents perhaps a better analog, except that it was so shallow. So it didn't invoke the sorts of processes that, that also occurred in the Deepwater Horizon spill. I think you're right. I tend to call this particular new spill a tale of two spills, because it had components that matched what you might call, euphemistically, the traditional spill, which is to say an oil that rises quickly to the surface.
Or starts at the surface.
Or starts at the surface in the case of tanker accidents and other things. And then, depending upon winds and currents and distance from shore, is transported into shore. So that the injuries biologically occur with organisms that live on the surface or use the surface skin of the sea. Those include, obviously, seabirds high on the list, and we all saw terrible images after the 1989 Exxon Valdez, and then revisited that, if it was a revisit, with images from the pelicans and others from the Gulf spill. So that's the first order. It affects sea turtles. Don't have them in Alaska, so they weren't at risk. And marine mammals on the surface, plus a variety of other things, such as larvae, eggs, and early life stages of a variety of marine organisms as well. Then, if the currents are right and it comes to shore, then we have grounding of the oil on sensitive shoreline habitats. And we heard from Wes about two of them, sandy beaches and salt marshes. Those are the dominant two that we think about, but there are others like seagrass beds, oyster reef habitat, shallow subtidal habitats, and intertidal mudflats, for example. And so that's the traditional aspect of this spill. The non-traditional aspect is the tremendous emulsification and dispersion of the particles that occurred at depth. And what that did is to retain Wes's estimate. I can't dispute. I don't know that we'll ever know the exact number. We retain something like 2/3 of the mass of this oil beneath the surface. Also, we retained virtually all of the natural gas beneath the surface. And this was an oil and gas release. And so we need to think of that when we think of mass balance in the system and when we think of microbial production that is stimulated by the fixed carbon. It's something like what we know in the shallow water Gulf, or could be, in eutrophication, although it didn't appear to get to this degree in the deeper Gulf waters, as judged by measurements of dissolved oxygen.
Yeah, the dissolved oxygen, I guess, went down somewhat, but not very dramatically. And in the statistics I've heard about how much methane were in there, it's someplace between 30 and 40% of the hydrocarbons came out in the form of methane. Ed is nodding in agreement about that. And let me back up a little bit, Pete, before we pass the mic, and ask you about to look a little bit at the megafauna that is obviously the easiest thing to sort of have an immediate emotional reaction to. And certainly in Prince William Sound, if I remember correctly, it was like 250,000 seabirds oiled and killed. And here...
Tremendous numbers.
Yeah, and here, apparently a much smaller number. Does that sound right to you? 2,500, a couple thousand? And
here's what you've got to be aware of. We are working off of pieces of information that are released. And I think the information release from some of the surveys has probably exceeded what we had at this stage in the Exxon Valdez oil spill. In both cases, the litigation-sensitive nature of that information has meant that we haven't gotten it very quickly. But I think we've gotten it more quickly this time, especially on various, for example, NOAA websites. And so what we know is how many oiled dead birds, for example, those are our megafauna here of most interest, have been collected. Okay, so for example, it's a fair number of gulls. They lead the pack. Brown pelicans are up there. Black skimmers, a variety of others, some terns and other. I mean, the bird list is long of dead birds. So that's the most obvious. But here's where we can make the mistake and where I'm happy to correct you. You'll be back correcting me in a minute. And that is that those are how many have been collected. Okay, so you're a bird, you die, you're not immediately taken to the cemetery and have a proper ceremony. Here's what happens. Maybe you're collected by the scientists and others that are out there. Maybe you sink and you're never seen again. Maybe you're transported out in a current in a direction that carries you away from where anyone is looking. Or maybe you're eaten by sharks. There's a wonderful study that came out just recently that looked at tiger shark guts around oil platforms outside of Mobile Bay. And these were tiger sharks in an area where there wasn't a great deal of oil at the time. But these were during April, during the passerine bird migration season, when birds are migrating up from Mexico, South America, coming back into North America. These are some of the birds that are really in trouble, the ones we love and feed in our backyards. And these tiger sharks were absolutely loaded in their guts with feathers of passerine birds. The interpretation is that as they approach the coast, they migrate at night, so you need to know that. The lights on these platforms disorient. So they circle the platforms until they get too tired, then they crash to sea or rest in the sea, and that becomes their final resting place.
Yeah, okay.
And so here's the point. Those numbers that we have not been corrected by the transport models and the models for consumption by scavengers. And when they are, we'll have a different impression of how many birds actually died.
Yeah, well, that's why I asked. It's good to know, so let's keep an eye on that. And Dave, let me turn to you from Corpus Christi. Obviously, we are. I mean, what we're going to
You want me to put a price on this?
What we're going to reveal in the next hour is what the long-term impact of this oil spill is. So, and of course, the focus, a lot of biologists in the room, so a lot of focus is on biology. But let's not forget this is a tremendous human impact beyond the 11 men who were actually killed in the sinking of the Deepwater Horizon. And I want you to give us a flavor for what that means in terms of, let's just start with some basics about the economics of the Gulf of Mexico.
Right.
Where does oil and gas fit in, and how much was the entire economic system disrupted by this spill? And down the line will be my second question. So
okay.
you know.
Okay. Well, before I begin, I want to say, economics is usually referred to as the dismal science, but Pete, I mean, after that, I'm going to hand that mantle over to you. Yeah. There's really a tale of two economies here. There's kind of the traditional market economy, and I'll talk to that about in a moment. And there's also what I would call nature's economy. So we did a study a few years ago that looked at the productive value of the Gulf of Mexico, and it took into account oil and gas production, tourism, fisheries, and shipping or port operations. And we looked at that in the United States and Mexico, and unfortunately we didn't have the information for Cuba. What we found in this productive value, and this is the extractive resources, what we found is that value per year was about $294 billion, just in those four sectors, just in those extractive values, not counting the multiplier effects.
What were the four again?
Oil and gas, fisheries, tourism, and then also shipping.
Which
yes.
is not exactly extractive, is it?
Well, yeah, but they need to be on they need to be on the Gulf to be able to do their business.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
Okay,
So go on.
All right. So what we found, $294 billion per year, but that doesn't sound like a lot. I mean, there's a lot of big numbers thrown around today. So let me put $294 billion in context. If the Gulf of Mexico was its own country, and $294 billion was its GDP, it would rank 29th out of 230 countries in the world. That would put it ahead of Chile, or Venezuela, or Finland, or Peru. So it's just in those four sectors, it's very, very productive, very important economic engine. On the nature economy side, those goods and services that aren't taken into account in the market, there's a tremendous impact on human well-being. For example, if you look at salt marsh, two services that are provided there, such as storm protection, disturbance regulation, and waste regulation or filtration. What we found that if you add those two together, each acre of salt marsh in the Mississippi Delta and along the Gulf Coast would provide about $2,400 worth of benefits per year. Now what we did also was we calculate, okay, what if 500,000 acres were to be impacted by this spill? Well, that would put those two services only at $1.2 billion. So that's a tremendous benefit that we derive by just having to take care of that resource.
And how much of that has been disrupted?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, the other panelists could probably get a better sense of how much has been disrupted. I do know that the marsh hasn't been as severely impacted as was once thought, that the roots haven't been compromised, and so growth has come back, but I'm sure these other panelists could talk to that better.
But overall, in terms of I mean, you obviously lost a year of fisheries. You
Yes.
slowed down the oil and gas, but certainly didn't
Yes.
stop it for a year.
Yeah.
Shipping, I guess they had to dodge
Yeah,
flotillas of skimmers and so on.
Yeah, but that was, you know, the biggest impacts obviously had come in fisheries and come in tourism, and also oil and gas. There was some questions about the moratorium. What would it do to the economy? What would it do to the economic engines of southern Louisiana and Texas and Alabama and Mississippi? Actually, you know, it was projected that, you know, maybe 8,000 to 12,000 people would be put out of work during the moratorium, but a recent study by GNO Inc., which is the Greater New Orleans Incorporated, which is the economic community there, found that, you know, the anecdotal evidence just isn't there. I mean, there was some impact, but a lot of these firms kept people working, dug into their savings, but, you know, found that if we released these people, it was going to be more expensive to bring them back. So the moratorium didn't have the impact that people were projecting.
And tourism obviously took a big hit, but it might come back. Let me turn back to Wes and ask about fisheries, because obviously it could have been worse with the amount of marshland that was hit and so on. But what kind of impact do you expect to see on fisheries? I mean, there's all this oil in the water. Oil is toxic. There's dispersant. Dispersant is toxic. And you know, any clues or any way of sort of gauging what that's going to look like?
Well, if we could look back at the Ixtoc spill as a starter, and then I'll come to the present spill. A colleague in Mexico at the University of Mexico in Mexico City, Luis Soto, had been studying the shrimp fishery in Campeche in the southeastern Gulf before the Ixtoc spill, and he said that after 2 years it was back to what it was before the Ixtoc spill.
Just 2 years. Yeah.
There aren't many examples anywhere for us to look at to tell for sure. In the Persian Gulf spill, there was a complete collapse of the shrimp fishery there. So there are different factors in each place to consider. If we look in the northern Gulf, the fishery groups that people care about, the shrimp, the crabs, the oysters, and the finfish as a large lump, huge amounts come from the Gulf of Mexico. Over 70% of the shrimp for the whole nation come from the Gulf. A little under 70% of all the oysters for the nation come from the Gulf of Mexico. So these are huge populations that are fished, and each are a little bit different. The shrimp, maybe in the Ixtoc case, is the fact that generally in that case the oil was on the surface, the shrimp live on the bottom. That's a pretty simplistic way of looking at it, but that may be the case. They do have floating eggs, and larvae actually move up and down in the water column that could have moved through the dispersant. The marshes that Ed mentioned a while ago, the edge of the marshes is the best place for the juvenile blue crabs and the shrimp to grow up. So it's really an important area, and some of that was impacted. So we may see a percentage reduction in fisheries, say, this year, but I wouldn't be surprised if the fisheries was pretty much back on a similar trend as what it was before, partly because of the closures, some indications from Dauphin Island Sea Lab and sampling that was done there. Their numbers show huge biomass that was collected in shrimp trawls, 4 times the shrimp numbers that they'd collected before, partly because nobody else was out there shrimping. And so that should help the...
So the one-year hiatus, essentially, in shrimping might actually
reduce
the overfishing or the fishing pressure, right? I'm sorry?
Yes, with other things also, not just the shrimp, but because this is a biologist interpretation, not a geospatial scientist now,